Hi there folks. So it's February and I know a lot of you will be thinking towards Valentine's Day and all things romantic. Now, I have a confession to make. I'm not a huge fan of Valentine's Day and I don't buy a lot of novels that are in the romance genre. That doesn't mean to say that I don't like a good love story. I like a lot of rom-com films. I don't mind a real good love interest in a book. I just don't like anything too sentimental, over sentimental, or too slushy. And I don't tend to buy books in the romance genre. So what have I got for you today? Well, I've got some good classic novels, some old classics and some more in the sort of modern classic genre that have either you might call a romance novel or have a very strong love interest in them. So I have 8 books for you and I'm going to do them in order of when they were published. So I'm starting with one of the best loved classic romances of all time, really, and that is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. You can't go wrong with this novel. It's the love story is one that is much loved. It's the story of 2 people who hate each other at first sight and gradually fall in love with each other. What's not to like about that? And it was published in 1813, in the Regency period, of course. And if you don't already know, it's the story of Elizabeth Bennet, the second oldest of the 5 Bennet sisters, whose mother is desperate to get them all married off to a wealthy man. That very famous opening line shows us Austen's very witty and ironic sense of humour. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Well, by saying that, it is an irony because it is not a truth universally acknowledged. It's a truth believed to be so by many young ladies of the time and their mothers, but not necessarily the case. It just, that just encompasses Jane Austen's viewpoint on the world and of society. And, it just continues from there. It's very much, her works are very much a commentary on, I suppose, the hypocrisies of society in many ways, but done in a very witty and amusing way, which makes her books such a joy. And of course, all of her, she only wrote 6 full completed novels, and they are all love stories, of course. So if you've read Pride and Prejudice but you haven't read all of them, of course my other favourites, Sense and Sensibility, about 2 sisters, and Emma. I love Emma. It's one of the first Austens I read, so I have a very strong affection for Emma. So yeah, so any of Jane Austen's books would be a good love story for this time of year, but in particular Pride and Prejudice, the most well-known, the most loved. Excellent story, so well structured. If you've never read it, you must. It's an absolute must. Now, some of these books on this list I have mentioned in other book lists, so forgive me for repeating myself a bit, but I cannot do classic romantic novels without mentioning this one. This is an old copy, and it is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And This was published in 1847 and published, by the way, under the name of Ellis Bell. All the Bronte sisters published under pseudonyms that were male names because it was much easier to get published if the public thought you were a man. Different times. What can I say about Wuthering Heights? Love, passion, obsession, tragedy, revenge, jealousy, all set against the backdrop of the wild Yorkshire moors. It's all you ever need in a romantic novel, isn't it? That's it. If you've never read any Brontes, start with Wuthering Heights. Or, I haven't got a copy, but Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre is another really good one. I read that when I was at school and absolutely loved it. So, yeah, for a really good romantic novel by the Brontes, Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. My next book, I'm just going to read you the opening lines because I love this. When Farmer Oak smiled, the corners of his mouth spread till they were within an unimportant distance of his ears. His eyes were reduced to mere chinks, and diverging wrinkles appeared round them, extending upon his countenance like the rays in a rudimentary sketch of the rising sun. His Christian name was Gabriel, and on working days he was a young man of sound judgment, easy motions, proper dress, a general good character. I love that. I love that as an opening description of one of the main characters in Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. This was published in 1874 and it was Thomas Hardy's fourth novel and at the time his most popular. As many Victorian novels did, it appeared first of all in monthly instalments in a magazine. It's the story of the main character is actually Bathsheba, a young woman, obviously, who befriends Gabriel, the young shepherd. They form a friendship. She at one point saves his life and he falls in love with her, but she has other fish to fry. She has two other men fall in love with her over the period of the novel. She marries one of them, much to Gabriel's despair. And, well, let's just say it progresses. And I'm not going to, say any more than that. But it is a lovely sweet love story set in Hardy's country, what he called Wessex, which he took from the old Roman and Anglo-Saxon area in the midwest of England. We know Thomas Hardy to set his novels in that beautiful countryside, but it also details the realities of farming life, the harsh realities of farming life and the farming community in rural Victorian England. If you've not read much Thomas Hardy, it's probably a good one to start with. My next book, I know, is a little controversial for some of you, and I've mentioned it before because this copy is very special to me. It's Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. I couldn't really not include this in my book of romantic novels because the heart of the story is so wonderful, the love story in it. And of course, Margaret Mitchell tells the story of the American Civil War from the point of view of the Confederates, and that's what makes it controversial because they were the ones fighting for their way of life, which of course included keeping slaves. And so it does cause a little bit of discomfort sometimes when you're reading it. It's true. But it is interesting. It's always interesting to look at stories from the more difficult point of view. Because we always, we should all see things from another person's point of view. We don't necessarily have to agree with them, but it is interesting to see how that works. And of course, she paints quite a positive picture of the plantations, with the slaves being well looked after and well cared for, which of course I'm sure wasn't always the case. But if you can get around that, if you can read it and just remember this is just from the Confederates' point of view, you don't have to agree with it, then you can enjoy the wonderful love story at its heart. The very selfish, vain, beautiful Scarlett O'Hara, one of the most intriguing characters, I think, in American literature, believes herself to be in love with Ashley Wilkes right through most of the novel. Unfortunately, Ashley Wilkes marries somebody else, and Rhett Butler comes into her life, who immediately is attracted to her, and she immediately disdains, but you can see straight away the chemistry and electricity between them. So you know right from that meeting, this is going to be an interesting ride. And of course, a lot of it then is the Civil War breaks out, and there's a lot of really interesting detail about the war, the awfulness of war, the story of Scarlett O'Hara and all her men, because she marries somebody she's not at all interested in, almost out of spite. She marries again. And it's a story, as well as a story of great love and passion and about war, it's also a story of survival and how when the South is defeated, how she survives. It's an incredible, epic story if you can get around those, the uncomfortable bits. So, yeah, I do recommend Gone with the Wind, but reading this novel doesn't mean you have to agree with the politics in it. And the film was pretty darn good too, considering it was made in 1939. Still stands the test of time today. Extraordinary film, and a really long one too. Good film to watch at Valentine's, I think. Now, you recognise the first lines from this novel? Last night I dreamt I went to Mandalay again. Another famous opening line from Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Oh, the nice picture of Daphne du Maurier there. Oh, this is a rather nice hardback edition I bought some time ago. Rebecca was published in 1938. If you haven't read Daphne du Maurier before, it's probably a good one to start with. I'd also recommend for a good romantic read Frenchman's Creek. She wrote a lot of novels set in her beloved Cornwall. And Rebecca is about a young, quite naive woman who meets the charming Mr. De Winter. And after a short courtship, they marry, and he takes her back to his huge home on the Cornish coast. And it all seems lovely, except Mr. De Winter is a widow, and there is a mystery about his previous wife, Rebecca. For Rebecca is not our heroine. We never know the name of the main character, interestingly. It's very interesting that she calls it Rebecca, because she kind of forms a kind of main theme of the novel, even though she's dead. So when our main character goes back to this house, she meets the rather awful housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, who takes an instant dislike to her. She loved the previous Mrs. De Winter, and she does her best to make feel unloved, unwanted. It's probably a really good example of what we call gaslighting, and feels less and less confident about her relationship with her new husband. And there is, of course, the mystery of what happened to the first wife. And the tension builds in this novel. It's so brilliant. It's a thriller. I've put this into the list. It's not, I suppose, it's not your obvious choice of romantic novels, because the couple marry early on and all seems fine. So it's basically about how Mrs. De Winter, as we'll call her, the new Mrs. De Winter, copes with the rivalry of the dead wife. And the tension really builds because we don't know what happened to the first wife. She was supposed to have died in a boating accident, if I remember rightly. But there is a mystery over it, and that I'm not going to say any more if you haven't read it, because it does become a real thriller of a novel towards the end. So, one of Daphne du Maurier's best and best loved books, and the romantic part is that relationship between the Mr. De Winter, the new Mrs. De Winter. Is that going to work? Is that going to succeed in the end? You'll have to read it to find out if you haven't already. Great books. Daphne du Maurier, one of my favourites. Now, if you're just wondering what's happened to the daylight, I managed to do this next section without having been recording. So I had to come back later and do it all over again. Happy days. So, a bit of a different book, this, and it's another story of love set against the backdrop of war. And it is Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. Set in two time periods, the main period being before, during and after the First World War, and the other period being, I think, in the 1970s, when the main character's granddaughter is trying to find out more about his life and how that information affects her life. It's about a young man called Stephen who is visiting Paris and falls in love with a woman called Isabel, who is already married, and they have an affair. But obviously things go wrong and the war happens. His experiences during the war are pretty horrific, as well are the experiences of most people in that war. I have to say that the scenes in the war are so moving, so realistic, and so horrific. It's one of the only books that has actually made me cry out loud. It's incredibly moving and tragic. But after the war, he does manage to find Isabel again, but I will leave it there. It's just an incredible novel, and it's whether or not you want it for the love story or for the very moving account of the experience of that war. It's an excellent read. I do recommend it, but it is difficult in parts. As well as the awfulness of war, it's also about the enduring power of love. So while maybe not an obvious choice for a romantic novel, it certainly has a love story as a very strong theme. I recommend it. I'll hold that up again in case I didn't hold it long enough. I know some of you say I don't hold them up long enough for you, but there we go. Birdsong by Sebastian, folks. I highly recommend it. And I mentioned earlier, of course, the first book I mentioned was Pride and Prejudice. And the thing with Pride and Prejudice is that the format for that love story was so popular, so great, that many people have kind of almost copied it. That format of people hating each other at first sight and falling in love. And it was used, of course, in the film You've Got Mail, which of course was based on the book The Little Shop Around the Corner. And they actually mention Pride and Prejudice in that. And another book that does the same is this novel, Bridget Jones' Diary by Helen Fielding, which was published in 1994 and made into that great film with Renée Zellweger and Hugh Grant and Colin Firth. If you think of this as being a kind of modern day version of Pride and Prejudice, we obviously Bridget Jones is kind of Elizabeth Bennet, and Daniel, it's kind of based on Mr. Wickham. The other love interest, if you like, she actually calls Darcy, Mark Darcy, played by Colin Firth in the film. So she unashamedly names one of the characters after Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. And of course, in Bridget Jones' Diary, they start off by pretty well disliking each other. They meet when her parents throw a New Year's Day party where he is wearing a horrible Christmas jumper. She is just being Bridget. And but of course, she is much more attracted to the dangerous and charming Daniel Cleaver, who works in her office. And of course, comedy ensues. And if you've seen the film, you know Bridget and Daniel Cleaver form a relationship. He's terribly, terribly shallow. But of course, just as in Pride and Prejudice, Mark Darcy starts to warm to her before she does. And of course, it's in the book, it's told in diary form. It's Bridget Jones' Diary. Of course it does. I love books told in diary form because it allows the character of the protagonist to really, really shine through. And you can read between the lines. It's really good for comedy. I beg your pardon, Tilly. And it's a book that I think most of us women can probably relate to. Here she is. Yay, my little girl. We've all had crushes on the wrong man, haven't we? And, you know, so it's really a book that you can very much relate to. And if you've seen the film but you haven't read the book, do, because as always, the books are always better than the film, even though the film is excellent. So I do recommend that for a bit of comedy romance. Oh, you're my little Valentine, aren't you? Right? You are. Now, my last book on this list, maybe not an obvious choice for a romance novel, but it does have a very strong love theme, and this is The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger, and it was published in 2005. So just fits into a modern classic, and I really think it certainly should be a classic, as it will last the test of time, which is basically the definition of a classic. And it is an extraordinary and very original book, and the premise is extremely strange and quirky. It's about a married couple, and the husband Henry has a rare genetic condition, which means he actually time travels within his own lifetime. So he gets pulled back into the past and into the future and into the present. And basically, it's about how they, as a couple, cope with this. And we meet them at different times, of course, as it says on the back. The extraordinary love story of Claire and Henry, who met when Claire was 6 and Henry was 36, and were married when Claire was 22 and Henry 30. Impossible, but true. So they have to cope with, sometimes one of them remembers when they met and the other one's not quite there yet. And it's weird and wonderful and extraordinary and really well written. So I really recommend this. And incidentally, oh, you want to get down, don't you? Go on. This book was given to me by my sister-in-law, and I was so thankful that she gave it to me, because I found it very inspirational as a writer, because my books are quite quirky and have sort of strange things happening in them, and for a while I felt that maybe they were too quirky, too strange premises. Like, if you've read Out of Time, you'll know what I mean. When I read A Time Traveller's Wife, I thought, if she can have a bestseller about a man who travels within his own lifetime, then I can write anything, and it doesn't matter. So it was very much a turning point for my own writing when I read this. So it's kind of a special book for me. And I really hope that if you haven't read it, you will read it and see exactly what I mean. So there you have it. That is my romantic novel book list, and maybe a little bit different to some other Valentine's Day book lists you might find. And I hope you've enjoyed having a look through these books from my bookshelf. And I wish you all, those of you who are in relationships or about to embark on a relationship, I wish you a very happy Valentine's Day, and I hope that you all have a lovely romantic time. Onwards with February, lots more to talk about this month. So I will see you again very soon. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and please do comment. I love your comments. Can't always reply to everyone, but I read them all. So thanks very much for watching and commenting. Bye for now.